January 30th, 1933. Berlin. Wilhelmstrasse. The snow fell in silent curtains over the capital that evening, muffling the roar of the crowd gathered beneath the Reich Chancellery's windows. Torchlight flickered against the stone facades of government buildings, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with anticipation. In the streets below, thousands of brown-shirted men marched in disciplined columns, their boots creating a rhythmic thunder that echoed off the frozen cobblestones. The air carried the acrid smell of burning pitch and coal smoke, mingling with the breath of thousands gathered in the January cold. Above them, framed in the illuminated window like a figure in a theater, stood a man who had spent the last decade clawing his way from the fringes of German politics to this moment. Adolf Hitler, at 43 years old, had just been appointed Chancellor of Germany. The torches below were not merely celebration, they were announcement. Something fundamental had shifted in the machinery of European civilization, though few yet understood the magnitude of what had begun. The story of how this moment arrived, how a failed artist and decorated war veteran had transformed a fringe political movement into the governing force of Europe's most cultured nation, cannot be understood without first traveling back through the wreckage of the previous decade, through the humiliation of Versailles, through the chaos of Weimar, through the private bitterness of one man who believed he alone could diagnose Germany's sickness and prescribe its cure. This was not an inevitable march to power. It was a convergence of economic catastrophe, political miscalculation, nationalist resentment, and the deliberate exploitation of democratic weakness by men who understood how to turn desperation into devotion. The Nazi regime did not spring fully formed from the earth. It was built, piece by piece, speech by speech, crisis by crisis, until the institutions meant to contain it had been hollowed from within. To understand the beginning requires understanding the end that preceded it. The collapse of Imperial Germany in November 1918, when the Kaiser's armies finally broke after 4 years of industrial slaughter. The armistice came not from battlefield defeat alone, but from internal disintegration. Mutinies in the navy, strikes in the factories, revolution in the streets. When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, Germany's soldiers believed they had agreed to an honorable peace, a negotiated settlement between exhausted equals. What they received instead felt like betrayal. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors where the German Empire had been proclaimed 48 years earlier, imposed terms that seemed designed not just to defeat Germany, but to humiliate it. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war's outbreak. Territorial losses stripped away 13% of European territory and all colonial possessions. The military was reduced to a mere 100,000 men, forbidden to possess tanks, aircraft, or submarines. And the reparations, 132 billion gold marks, a sum so astronomical that economists predicted it would take generations to repay, seemed designed to keep Germany prostrate indefinitely. For many Germans, particularly those who had served in the trenches, this felt incomprehensible. They had fought with courage, had held the line against overwhelming odds, had nearly broken through to victory in the spring of 1918. The homeland had not been invaded. No Allied soldier had set foot on German soil. How then had Germany lost? The answer, whispered in beer halls and barracks, was treason. The stab in the back, legend, the myth that Germany's armies had been betrayed by socialists, communists, and Jews on the home front, took root with the virulence of pandemic. It was a lie, but it was a useful lie, one that preserved military honor while providing a scapegoat for national trauma. And no one would weaponize this lie more effectively than Adolf Hitler. He had returned from the war a different man than the aimless drifter who had enlisted in August 1914. Born in the Austrian border town of Braunau am Inn in 1889, Hitler's early life had been marked by failure and drift. His father, a customs official, had been stern and distant. His mother, whom he adored, died of breast cancer when he was 18, leaving him emotionally unmoored. He had dreamed of becoming an artist, had twice applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and had twice been rejected. His watercolors showed technical competence, but lacked the spark of genuine talent. They were the work of a man who could copy reality, but not reimagine it. For years he had lived in flophouses and men's shelters in Vienna, selling postcards and sketches for pocket money, reading voraciously, developing an ideology of racial hierarchy and anti-Semitism absorbed from the city's gutter press and folkish pamphlets. The war had given his life meaning. He served as a dispatch runner in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, a dangerous position that earned him the Iron Cross, First Class, a rare decoration for an enlisted man. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel in 1916 and again by mustard gas in October 1918, which temporarily blinded him. By all accounts, he was a strange figure among his comrades, solitary, humorless, never receiving packages from home, never joining the crude banter about women and drink. But he was brave, and bravery earned respect. The war gave him comrades, purpose, and a belief that he belonged to something greater than himself. When it ended in what he perceived as betrayal, that belief curdled into rage. In the chaotic aftermath of German defeat, Hitler found his calling not as an artist, but as a speaker, assigned by the army to monitor political groups in Munich, a city convulsed by communist revolution and right-wing reaction. He attended a meeting of the tiny German Workers' Party in September 1919. The group was negligible, fewer than 60 members, led by a railway locksmith named Anton Drexler, who combined working-class nationalism with anti-capitalist and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Hitler was preparing to leave when another attendee proposed that Bavaria should break away from Germany and join Austria. The idea enraged him. He rose and delivered an impromptu rebuttal so passionate, so articulate, so filled with conviction that Drexler immediately recognized his value. Hitler joined as member number 555. The party inflated its membership rolls to appear larger than it was, and within months had become its most effective propagandist. He discovered he possessed a rare gift. When he spoke, something happened. His voice, initially thin and uncertain, grew in power as he fed off the crowd's energy. He used pauses like a conductor uses silence, building tension before releasing it in thunderous denunciation. He spoke not to the intellect, but to emotion, to resentment, to wounded pride. He gave his audience's enemies to hate, the Versailles Treaty makers, the November criminals who had signed the armistice, the Marxists, the international financiers, and always, the Jews, whom he portrayed as a parasitic race responsible for Germany's degradation. His speeches followed a pattern: begin slowly, establish grievance, identify the enemy, offer salvation through national rebirth, build to a crescendo of righteous fury. Men left his speeches feeling they had experienced something transformative, a political revival meeting. The party grew. In 1920, it renamed itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, contracted to Nazi. The name was calculated: national, to appeal to patriotic sentiment; socialist, to attract working-class support. Though Hitler's socialism had nothing to do with Marxist internationalism and everything to do with subordinating economic activity to the racial community, the Volksgemeinschaft. The party adopted symbols designed for maximum psychological impact. The swastika, an ancient symbol appropriated and tilted to represent dynamic movement. The red flag, stolen from the communists, but with the swastika replacing the hammer and sickle. The stiff-armed salute, and the endless formations of uniformed men, creating a visual language of strength and unity. In 1921, Hitler consolidated his control. When party leadership attempted to merge with other nationalist groups, he threatened to resign. Knowing his speaking ability made him indispensable. He demanded and received dictatorial powers within the party, becoming its unquestioned Führer, leader. He understood instinctively that movements built on emotion and resentment required absolute authority, that committees and debate diluted the message. He surrounded himself with men who would become his instruments: Rudolf Hess, his loyal secretary; Hermann Göring, a decorated fighter ace who lent the party military credibility; Ernst Röhm, who commanded the Sturmabteilung; the SA, the brown-shirt brawlers who protected Nazi meetings and disrupted those of rivals; and later, Heinrich Himmler, whose organizational fanaticism would build the machinery of genocide. By 1923, the Nazi Party had grown to approximately 55,000 members, concentrated in Bavaria. But membership meant little without power. Hitler watched as Germany descended into economic apocalypse. The Weimar Republic's decision to finance reparations through money printing triggered hyperinflation of almost incomprehensible scale. In January 1923, $1 bought 18,000 marks. By November, that same dollar bought 4.2 trillion marks. Life savings evaporated. Pensions became worthless. Workers received wages in wheelbarrows and spent them within hours before prices doubled again. The middle class, traditionally the bedrock of social stability, saw its world dissolve. A teacher's annual salary couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The social contract had broken. Hitler believed the moment had come. On November 8, 1923, he and his followers stormed a beer hall in Munich where Bavarian leaders were meeting, fired a pistol into the ceiling, and declared a national revolution. The beer hall putsch was supposed to be Germany's Mussolini moment. The Italian fascist had marched on Rome the previous year and seized power. But Hitler was not Mussolini, and Germany was not Italy. The putsch was poorly planned and collapsed within 16 hours. Police fired on the Nazi marchers as they advanced through Munich, killing 16. Hitler fled but was arrested 2 days later. He could have been executed for treason. Instead, the trial became his stage. The judges were sympathetic. Many in Bavaria's conservative establishment viewed the Nazis as crude but useful allies against communism. Hitler was allowed to speak at length, turning his trial into a propaganda platform. He accepted responsibility but denied criminality, framing his actions as patriotic necessity. "I alone bear the responsibility," he declared, "but I am not a criminal because of that. If today I stand here as a revolutionary, it is as a revolutionary against the revolution. There is no such thing as high treason against the traitors of 1918. The courtroom erupted in applause. He was sentenced to 5 years, but served only 9 months in comfortable detention at Landsberg prison, where he dictated the first volume of his political testament, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The book is barely readable, a turgid mixture of autobiography, political theory, and racial ideology. But within its pages lay the blueprint for everything that would follow. Hitler laid out his belief in racial struggle as the engine of history, with the Aryan race as civilization's creator and the Jew as its destroyer. He argued for Lebensraum, living space, to be seized in the East, where Slavic populations would be enslaved or eliminated to make room for German colonization. He advocated for a totalitarian state led by an infallible leader, for the subordination of individual rights to racial community, for the glorification of war as the ultimate test of national vitality. Critics dismissed it as the ravings of a failed putschist. They were wrong. Upon release in December 1924, Hitler found a changed landscape. The hyperinflation had been tamed through a new currency and American loans. The economy stabilized. Political extremism receded as prosperity returned. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, the Nazis won only 2.6% of the vote, 12 seats out of 491. The party seemed destined for irrelevance. Hitler adjusted his strategy. If he could not seize power through revolution, he would win it through elections, then destroy democracy from within. He built a sophisticated propaganda apparatus, organized party branches in every region, created auxiliary organizations for women, youth, students, and professionals. The party would be a state within a state, ready to expand the moment opportunity arrived. Opportunity arrived in October 1929, when the New York Stock Exchange collapsed and took the world economy with it. American loans that had sustained German recovery were recalled. Banks failed. Factories closed. Unemployment, which had stood at 1.3 million in September 1929, reached 3 million by September 1930 and would peak at 6 million, nearly a third of the workforce, by 1932. In cities like Hamburg and Cologne, unemployment exceeded 40%. The Depression destroyed more than jobs. It destroyed hope. Millions of young men who had grown up in Weimar's brief prosperity found themselves standing in endless lines for soup kitchens and welfare offices, watching their futures dissolve. The Weimar Republic, which had never fully recovered from its birth and defeat, began to hemorrhage legitimacy. Hitler offered simplicity in a world of chaos. While other politicians proposed complex economic reforms, he offered scapegoats and salvation. He blamed Germany's suffering on the Versailles Treaty, on reparations, on international Jewish finance, on Marxist subversion. He promised work, bread, national renewal. He promised to restore Germany's honor, to make the country strong again, to create a racially pure community where every German would find purpose and belonging. The message resonated. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazis won 18.3% of the vote and became the second-largest party in the Reichstag. 2 years later, in July 1932, they captured 37.4% and became the largest party. Hitler had become unavoidable, yet he was not inevitable. Germany's conservative establishment, the military officers, industrialists, landowners, and traditional politicians, viewed Hitler with mixture of contempt and calculation. They saw him as a useful tool. His movement could mobilize the masses and destroy the left, but surely he could be controlled, domesticated, made to serve their interests. This was the fatal miscalculation. In a series of backroom negotiations in late 1932 and early 1933, these conservative power brokers convinced the aging President Paul von Hindenburg, the former field marshal who had led Germany's armies in the Great War, to appoint Hitler as chancellor. They placed traditional conservatives in most cabinet positions, believing they could constrain him. Franz von Papen, who helped broker the deal, assured skeptics, "We've hired him for our purposes. In 2 months, we'll have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll squeak." January 30th, 1933. The appointment was announced. That night, the torchlight parade transformed Berlin's government quarter into a river of flame. For hours, SA columns marched in perfect formation while Hitler stood at the window, his right arm raised in salute, watching his forces celebrate. Goebbels, the party's propaganda chief, stood beside him and later recorded in his diary, "It is almost like a dream, a fairy tale. The new Reich has been born. 14 years of work have been crowned with victory." For most observers, it seemed like a normal transfer of power, perhaps unfortunate, but legal, constitutional, reversible. They failed to understand that democracy, once handed to men who despise it, does not survive by constitutional procedure alone. The destruction began immediately, though at first it was disguised as emergency measure and legal reform. On February 27, 1933, less than a month after Hitler took office, the Reichstag building burned. A Dutch communist was arrested at the scene and charged with arson. Whether the fire was Nazi provocation or lone act remains debated, but Hitler's response was calculated and swift. He declared the fire proof of communist conspiracy and convinced Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties for the protection of the people and state. Freedom of speech, press, assembly, and privacy disappeared overnight. Police could arrest and detain without warrant. The decree was presented as temporary, an emergency measure. It remained in force until 1945. With civil liberties suspended and political opponents under assault, Hitler called new elections for March 5, 1933. The campaign was conducted under conditions of systematic terror. SA thugs broke up opposition meetings, arrested rival candidates, and occupied the streets. The Prussian police, now under Nazi control, looked the other way or participated. Despite this intimidation, the Nazis won only 43.9% of the vote, a plurality but not a majority. Hitler needed more. On March 23, he presented the Reichstag with the Enabling Act, which would transfer legislative power from parliament to the cabinet for 4 years, effectively allowing Hitler to rule by decree. Passage required a 2/3 majority. Communist deputies had already been arrested or fled. Hitler now needed support from the Center Party, which represented Catholic interests. He made promises he had no intention of keeping: respect for Christian values, protection of the church, restraint in using his new powers. The Center Party, seeking to preserve what it could and fearing worse if it resisted, voted yes. Only the Social Democrats voted against it, their leader Otto Wels delivering a courageous but futile speech defending democracy and human rights. The Enabling Act passed, 441 to 94. Democracy had legally abolished itself. Within months, all political parties except the Nazi Party were banned or dissolved themselves. Trade unions were abolished and replaced with the German Labor Front. State governments were brought under central control. The independent judiciary was compromised. Opposition newspapers were closed or taken over. The civil service was purged of Jews and political unreliables. Germany was not yet a totalitarian state, but the architecture was rising swiftly. The speed of the transformation astonished even some Nazis. Within a year of Hitler's appointment, the Weimar Republic had ceased to exist in anything but name. The process was called Gleichschaltung, coordination, a bureaucratic term for revolutionary upheaval. Every institution, every organization, every aspect of public life was to be brought into alignment with Nazi ideology. The Hitler Youth absorbed other youth organizations. Professional associations were Nazified. Culture was subordinated to propaganda. Goebbels, now Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, understood that controlling the present required controlling information. Radio became a tool of indoctrination, with cheap receivers distributed widely to ensure every German household could hear Hitler's speeches. Film was mobilized for political purposes. Art that didn't serve the regime was banned as degenerate. Books were burned in massive public ceremonies, with students and professors enthusiastically feeding the flames. Works by Jewish authors, liberal thinkers, modernist writers, all reduced to ash in celebrations of anti-intellectualism. Throughout 1933 and 1934, one question remained. What about the SA? Ernst Röhm's brown shirts numbered in the millions and saw themselves as the revolution's vanguard, the armed force that had fought in the streets to bring Hitler to power. Röhm spoke openly of a second revolution, of sweeping away the traditional military and replacing it with a people's army led by the SA. The Army High Command, crucial to Hitler's plans for rearmament and expansion, viewed the SA with alarm and demanded action. Hitler faced a choice between his revolutionary street fighters and the professional military he needed for conquest. The decision was never in doubt. On June 30, 1934, the night of the Long Knives, Hitler struck. SS units, acting on lists prepared by Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, arrested or executed SA leaders across Germany. Röhm was shot in his cell after refusing to commit suicide. The official death toll was around 85, but the true number was certainly higher. Hitler used the purge to eliminate not just the SA leadership but old political enemies, conservative critics, and inconvenient witnesses to his past. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was murdered in his home, along with his wife. The killings were extra-legal murder, but Hitler went before the Reichstag and declared them justified as acts of state emergency, and the rubber-stamp parliament passed a law retroactively legalizing the executions. The message was clear. Hitler's will was law, and no one was safe from it. A month later, President Hindenburg died. Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer and Reich Chancellor. The army swore a new oath of allegiance, not to constitution or nation, but to Hitler personally. I swear by God this sacred oath, that I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people, supreme commander of the armed forces, and will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. Officers and soldiers would later cite this oath as reason for continuing to serve even when orders violated humanity and law. The military, which had believed it could control Hitler, had instead sworn itself to his service. By August 1934, the Nazi regime was consolidated. What had begun 18 months earlier as a coalition government dominated by conservatives had become a dictatorship. The transformation had been legal in its procedural mechanics, enabling acts, emergency decrees, retroactive legislation, but revolutionary in effect. Germany had become a Führerstaat, where all authority flowed from one man whose word was law and whose vision would reshape Europe. The regime's character was already apparent to those willing to see. The first concentration camp had opened at Dachau in March 1933, initially to hold political prisoners, communists, socialists, liberals, who were subjected to protective custody without trial. The camp system would expand, evolve, and ultimately industrialize murder on a scale previously unimaginable. The Nuremberg Laws, passed in September 1935, would codify racial hierarchy into law, stripping Jews of citizenship and forbidding marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Germans. These were not aberrations or excesses. They were the system functioning as designed. The world watched, but did not act. Foreign governments, preoccupied with their own economic struggles and desperate to avoid another war, pursued appeasement and accommodation. Britain and France, exhausted by the previous conflict and divided internally, convinced themselves that Hitler's demands were limited and could be satisfied. The Soviet Union, initially alarmed, eventually signed a non-aggression pact that gave Hitler freedom to move west. The United States, lost in isolationism, refused to see European problems as its concern. Dissenting voices, Churchill in Britain, Reynolds in the United States, émigrés and exiles who tried to warn the world, were dismissed as warmongers and alarmists. Meanwhile, Germany rearmed. The military, limited to 100,000 men by Versailles, expanded to 500,000 by 1935 and would reach 4 million by 1939. Conscription was reintroduced. The Luftwaffe was unveiled. Tanks rolled off assembly lines. The industrial might that had sustained 4 years of World War I was mobilized again, this time for a war of conquest and annihilation. The German people, by and large, acquiesced. Some with enthusiasm, many more with passive acceptance, others with private misgivings they dared not voice. The regime delivered on some of its promises. Unemployment fell dramatically through massive public works projects, the Autobahns, rearmament factories, and statistical manipulation that removed Jews and women from jobless counts. The economy recovered, though it was increasingly geared toward war production and sustained by deficit spending that could only be resolved through conquest and plunder. For many Germans, particularly those not targeted by racial laws, life improved materially. The chaos of Weimar gave way to order, even if that order came at the price of freedom. The regime understood that people will trade liberty for security, dignity for prosperity, truth for comforting lies, as long as the bargain is presented attractively enough and the consequences fall on someone else. Those consequences were already visible for anyone willing to look. Jewish businesses marked and boycotted. Jewish professionals barred from their occupations. Jewish children expelled from schools. Jewish families forced from their homes into overcrowded ghettos. The violence was punctuated by moments of explosive cruelty. The Kristallnacht pogroms of November 1938, when across Germany synagogues burned, shops were destroyed, and 91 Jews were murdered while police stood aside and firemen protected only non-Jewish property. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The regime then had the audacity to fine the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks for the damage inflicted upon them, a collective punishment for their own victimization. The message was clear: Jews had no place in Germany. Immigration, which had been encouraged through persecution, would eventually give way to something far worse. The pattern established domestically would be replicated internationally. In March 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in violation of Versailles and Locarno treaties. France and Britain protested but did nothing. In March 1938, German troops entered Austria and annexed it to the Reich in the Anschluss. The international community expressed concern and recognized the fait accompli. In September 1938, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and at Munich, Britain and France pressured the Czech government to surrender the territory in exchange for Hitler's promise that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain returned to London declaring peace for our time. 6 months later, Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. In September 1939, he invaded Poland. Finally, Britain and France declared war, but by then Hitler had built a military machine that would conquer most of Europe in less than 2 years. The regime that began on that snowy January evening in 1933 would last 12 years and claim perhaps 70 million lives, combat deaths, civilian casualties, systematic murder in concentration camps, and death pits across Eastern Europe. The Holocaust, the attempt to murder every Jew in Europe, would kill 6 million. Millions more, Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, disabled people, Roma, political prisoners, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, anyone deemed racially or politically unfit, would be worked to death, shot, gassed, starved. The war unleashed would destroy cities, displace entire populations, and redraw maps. When it finally ended in May 1945, Germany itself lay in ruins, divided among the victors, its cities reduced to rubble, its population starving, its name synonymous with industrial murder and aggressive war. How did it begin? The question is asked as if searching for a single cause, a moment when different choices might have produced different outcomes. But the Nazi regime's rise was not a single cause, but a convergence. It began with a peace treaty that humiliated rather than reconciled. It continued through economic catastrophe that destroyed the middle class and radicalized the desperate. It advanced through democratic institutions too weak to defend themselves and conservative elites too cynical to see the danger. It succeeded through Hitler's ability to articulate resentment and promise redemption, to make people feel their suffering had meaning and their enemies had faces. It was consolidated through violence, propaganda, and the systematic destruction of every independent institution and source of truth. It was enabled by foreign powers that preferred appeasement to confrontation and by ordinary people who made the calculation that their comfort was worth someone else's persecution. But perhaps the regime began earlier still, in ideas that predated Hitler and would outlive him. The belief that some races are superior to others. The conviction that might makes right and the strong have no obligations to the weak. The willingness to dehumanize the other, to reduce complex humanity to categories of worthy and unworthy, desirable and expendable. These ideas were not uniquely German. They appeared in various forms across Europe and America, in colonial projects and eugenics programs, in immigration restrictions and racial hierarchies. What made the Nazi regime unique was not the presence of these ideas, but their systematic implementation, their fusion with industrial efficiency and state power, their transformation from prejudice into policy into genocide. The Torchlight Parade of January 30th, 1933, was not destiny. It was choice. Thousands of individual choices by people who joined the party, who voted for Hitler, who looked the other way as neighbors disappeared, who convinced themselves that surely it wouldn't get worse, that someone else would stop it, that what happened to those people was not their concern. Millions of small accommodations, each seemingly rational in isolation, that accumulated into catastrophe. The regime began the moment enough people decided that democracy was too chaotic, that pluralism was too difficult, that thinking for themselves was too exhausting. It began when they traded the hard work of citizenship for the ease of obedience, when they chose the comfort of certainty over the burden of doubt. In the end, the snow that fell that January evening in Berlin covered a country that did not yet know what it was becoming. The men who marched with torches believed they were building a 1,000-year Reich, a reborn Germany that would dominate Europe and redeem the humiliations of Versailles. They built instead a charnel house, a regime whose defining legacy would be murder on an industrial scale. The beginning contained the end, for those with eyes to see it. The speeches about racial purity implied the death camps. The promises of living space implied the war of annihilation. The cult of the leader implied the erosion of all restraint. But most did not see, or seeing, did not act, or acting, acted too late. The Nazi regime began not in darkness, but in torchlight, not in secret, but in celebration, not despite democracy, but through it. That is the lesson that echoes across the decades, the warning that every generation must learn again. That civilization is fragile, that rights once surrendered are not easily reclaimed, that normal people in normal times are capable of extraordinary evil if given permission and purpose. The regime began when enough people stopped asking whether something was right and asked only whether it was permitted. It began when truth became negotiable and cruelty became policy. It began in a moment, but it was built through years of choices, each one making the next more possible, until the unthinkable became ordinary and the ordinary became monstrous. The smoke from those victory torches would eventually darken the skies over Europe, their light transforming into the flames of burning cities and the crematorium fires of Auschwitz. The crowd that cheered that evening could not see where the path led, or perhaps they did not want to see. They knew only that someone promised them greatness again, purpose again, pride again, and they were willing to follow wherever that promise led. By the time they discovered the price, it was too late to turn back. The regime had begun, and it would run its course to bitter end, leaving behind ruins and ashes and the eternal question, how could this have happened? The answer lies not in the extraordinary, but in the ordinary, not in the uniquely German, but in the universally human, not in the distant past, but in the choices that every society faces when fear and resentment meet ambition and opportunity. The Nazi regime began the way all such regimes begin, one compromise at a time, one fear exploited, one scapegoat blamed, one freedom surrendered, until the moment when people realize they have traded their humanity for security and discovered they have neither.